Hi, everybody here, and hi, everybody out there. Our speaker this evening, Dr. Casey Coomes, work with birds began when she attended college at Transylvania University, where she received her bachelor's degree in biology. She then went on to receive a PhD from the University of Tennessee Knoxville, where she focused her research on the effects of high temperatures in zebra finches. She is currently a visiting instructor and PRODiG fellow at SUNY Oneonta, where she teaches avian physiology and behavior. I'm anxious to learn all about Casey's research. Welcome, Casey.
One announcement I missed, which is we have a sign-up sheet back here for folks to bring refreshments to future meetings. If you're interested in doing that, to put your name on the sheet. Sorry.
Oh, no problem. All right, let's see if I can get this microphone to work. I'm not sure that it's wanting to turn on.
Oh.
Can everybody hear me okay? My students certainly tell me I am plenty loud enough. Thank you, Becky, for the introduction. As she mentioned, my name is Casey. I am a teaching fellow at SUNY Oneonta. Right now I'm teaching courses in evolutionary biology and in avian physiology and behavior. Before I get started, I wanted to give you all just a little bit about my background as a scientist. Staying closer. All right, I'm a walker, so thank you for the reminder. So I'm from Louisville, Kentucky. I went to Transylvania University where I got my bachelor's degree in biology. And there I worked with Dr. Becky Fox looking at parental behavior in house sparrows. So we had hundreds and hundreds of nest boxes at our field site. We'd go out there every day. And as you can see in this photo here, I'd be climbing up ladders on the side of barns, plucking out nestlings, putting them in a Dixie cup and weighing them at 6 o'clock every morning for 2 summers. And I absolutely fell in love with working with birds. I am going to give you all a little bit of a caveat though. I technically call myself a behavioral ecologist. So I study how animals interact and react to the environment. So you will probably know a lot more about specific birds than I do. So I will give you that caveat right off the bat. Yeah.
Small technical.
Uh-oh.
Susan. We see your screen notes.
Oh, you see my screen notes?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
those are old. Let's see. How can we get rid of these? I just get rid of them? Make them go away?
Full screen.
They're not shown on the screen, but they are.
Are they there now, or are they pretty much hidden?
I think that's it.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. So I started working with birds at Transylvania. Absolutely fell in love with it there. Then I went on to Tulane, where I started graduate school, and then again to the University of Tennessee Knoxville. And I worked in a lab where we studied the effects of human urbanization and human interactions with the environment on the behavior of birds, specifically white-crowned sparrows. So the first project I ever worked on, we looked at how noise pollution impacted birdsong. And as I was doing this project, I started thinking about all of these questions about how other impacts of urbanization can influence bird behavior. So one of the big things that stood out to me is cities are often heat islands. So they trap in a lot of high temperatures. They're often several degrees warmer than the rural areas around them. So I started to think that maybe these heat islands might be having an influence on bird behavior too. So as I dug more and more into it, I started getting more interested into the effects of heat waves. So a heat wave is a short period of really intense heat. So it's higher than normal. It usually lasts a few days or weeks as opposed to months or years. But temperatures can be much higher than average for long periods of time, and long enough to have significant impacts on humans and the environment. In the last several years, we've seen many, many headlines, I'm sure, of how heat waves are impacting both humans, the environment, and even the economy, with factories having to be shut down. In some cases, birds launching themselves out of nests as their nests get too warm. So there's definitely an interaction with heat and with bird behavior going on. So the reason I chose birds to study is because birds are extremely vulnerable to the effects of high temperatures. One big reason is they are active during the day. I mean, we're a room full of birders. We know that we're getting up early in the morning and during the day to go see birds. We're not out there at night. And this is when temperatures tend to be hotter. And especially during a heat wave, even those early morning temperatures can be way outside of what a bird normally experiences in its natural environment. And the other thing that makes them really vulnerable to heat stress is that they have really high energy needs. So if you have a pet bird, you probably noticed this, but you cannot go very long without giving that bird access to some sort of food. They have to have pretty much constant access to food in order to keep up their energy stores and to be active. A bird can starve to death in as little as a few hours because they have such high metabolic rates and they're burning off so much energy so quickly. And those high metabolic rates have a second effect, and that is that it actually produces heat itself. So if you think about maybe going for a walk or a jog on a 90-degree day versus this lovely 75-degree day out here, you're going to feel a lot hotter on that 90-degree day. So if you're jogging, right, than you would on that 75-degree day because of all that metabolic heat you're producing, that you're going to have to counteract that heat somehow, as opposed to, say, if you were walking when you're not producing as much metabolic heat. So these are things that make birds a lot more vulnerable to higher temperatures. So the first thing I wanted to go over before we dive into the real research on how high temperatures are affecting birds, we need to understand how birds control their own temperature. So thermoregulation is the process by which an animal maintains its internal temperature. And birds happen to be homeotherms and endotherms. So being a homeotherm means that they keep a constant body temperature within a small window. So humans, roughly 98.6. Birds are generally anywhere between 38 and 42 Celsius. And if I'm thinking that's like 105 to 110, if I'm doing that conversion correctly in my head. So they've got a pretty high body temperature, but they usually maintain it within that narrow window. But they also regulate this through internal processes. So they're not, say, like a lizard, which needs to go and bask itself in the sun to keep itself warm, or go find shade to cool itself down on a hot day. They can typically maintain their own temperature through their own internal processes. So birds typically thermoregulate when they experience temperatures outside of their comfort zone. I'm going to turn my head here to kind of point at the screen, so if you can't hear me, let me know. But this is a graph here that shows ambient temperatures, the surrounding temperature on this bottom axis, this x-axis here, and this y-axis is energy use. So if we look at the lowest point on this curve in zone B, that bird is spending the least amount of energy maintaining its own body temperature. So it's not having to work very hard to maintain its body temperature. But if temperatures are colder than that, they have to expend some energy trying to warm themselves up. So think like shivering, something like that. You're expending energy trying to bring your body temperature up. But above that zone, in zone C here, that's where we start to see heat stress and where birds have to start expending energy to cool themselves down. So birds use a number of strategies to keep themselves cool. One of the first lines of defense against heat stress is using thermal windows. So a thermal window is just an area where blood vessels are very, very close to the surface. And when it gets really hot, they can send blood to those areas, and that blood carries heat, and that heat can convect away from the bill, and it can carry off heat. So a really good example of this is a toucan's bill. They use that as kind of a radiator to keep themselves cool. But they can also use other strategies. So even birds with smaller beaks, they use those bills as a thermal window to get rid of heat. They often use their legs. So this is really common in something like a vulture. I'm sure many of you have heard that like vultures will often poop on their own legs to carry heat away from their body and regulate. And even sometimes their wings can be thermal windows, especially these under patches, kind of in their armpits, right? Where there's some skin exposure, heat can dissipate across those areas too. Now I've got a really cool example of how birds can use thermal windows here. So this was a study done by Tattersall and colleagues in 2009. And he looked at how toucans were able to thermoregulate. So like I said, the toucan has all of these blood vessels running along its bill where blood goes. And when temperatures are warmer, he opens those blood vessels up and all that blood runs to the surface of the beak. So where you see that orange, that means there's heat being dissipated. But when temperatures were cooler and he needed to maintain that heat, he was actually able to turn those blood vessels off and keep that heat from dissipating so he could keep it in his body. So birds have a lot of strategies for keeping themselves at that exact right temperature where they want to be for their bodies to function. Now, another thing that birds can do is use behavioral mechanisms to thermoregulate. So if you're out birding on a really hot day, you've probably seen birds doing something a little bit like this. This is a white-breasted chat, I believe. So he is panting for one. So that's very much like a dog would pant. You're having evaporative cooling, water's evaporating out of the mouth, carrying heat away from the body. And then he's also standing up really, really tall. So he's got those legs exposed, exposing those thermal windows to the air so he can get carried away. And you even kind of notice he's got his wings spread just a little bit to expose some of those underwing patches to let heat exchange take place. And sometimes they'll even stand up really straight and tall. This picture doesn't illustrate that very well, but they'll make their feathers really, really sleek against their body because when they're cold, those feathers fluff up, they get piloerect, and that traps air near the body to keep them warm. They want to do the opposite. So they want to keep that hot air away from their body when they're hot. So high temperatures can have a number of really, really negative effects. One of the most striking things that we see, the occurrence of mass mortality events. So this image was taken in 2009, I believe, near Perth, Australia. This image here depicts a shrub, and these things that are laying underneath that shrub, those aren't leaves. Those are actually thousands upon thousands of dead budgies and dead zebra finches that dropped dead pretty suddenly because temperatures soared really, really high. So heat is extremely, extremely dangerous for birds and is a really important thing to consider when we're considering bird conservation. So after we started to look at how birds were being affected, it really prompted a lot of studies looking into how bird populations were reacting to high temperatures in other parts of the world. So recent studies have shown in, I think, 2019 and 2020, that in North America, we've lost over 300 million birds since 1970. And that is almost a third of all of the bird species in North America. So of that, nearly 2/3 of those remaining birds are vulnerable to heat stress. So what we're seeing is a loss of a lot of biodiversity across North America, and we're predicted to see even more. So this map here is from Rosenberg et al.'s a study in, I think, trends in ecology and evolution, I believe. But those orange areas are places where we're predicting that we won't see birds come back after they migrate because they will be heading off to cooler areas. So as you can see, these blue areas, this is where we're going to see increases in biodiversity. So some areas where altitude's a bit higher or very far north into Canada, because those birds will be avoiding pretty much the whole of the continental US and trying to get to cooler areas to avoid some of these high temperatures. So the rising temperatures due to climate change can have a huge, huge impact on the biodiversity we even see right now. If I can get that to. So another thing that high temperatures can do is they can cause physiological stress. So there's a lot less research into this, especially in songbirds. There's a lot of agricultural research into physiological stress because, you know, we want to be able to produce eggs quickly and make sure chickens are healthy, all of this. One major thing that birds do is they produce heat shock proteins. And these are just molecules that help to mitigate the damage of heat stress. So as other chemical reactions start to go wonky, as temperatures get higher, these heat shock proteins come in and make sure that they're being carried out in the right way. So that is a sign that birds get heat stressed, and that can have impacts on behavior and on cognition in the brain. And another thing we start to see is increased levels of corticosterone, which is an avian stress hormone, that can cause also pretty drastic changes in behavior. So with that being said, some of these changes in behavior we see, some of them are pretty obvious. So you can see reductions in foraging behavior. So this is a southern pied babbler. That is a South African corvid. I think it's a corvid. That has shown that it forages a lot less efficiently. So it picks up less food in the same amount of time during hot temperatures than it would under normal temperature conditions. So it's not able to get that energy to carry out its usual functions. And we also see that in zebra finches, which are a small Australian songbird. And they were actually the bird I used for my dissertation. So I'm a little bit partial to them. But zebra finches will eat less. They divert a lot of their behavior to being near water sources, and their social interactions actually drop off pretty significantly. So you're seeing these behavioral trade-offs in favor of cooling behaviors and things that will keep them cool, instead of doing behaviors like social interactions and things that are less critical for your immediate survival. So another way that high temperatures can impact birds is through the impacts on nesting and nestlings and nesting behavior. So in Australia, it's been shown that high temperatures within the zebra finch range can sometimes even cook bird eggs before they've had the chance to hatch in the nest, because those temperatures get so high that those embryos cannot develop. And it also can lead to earlier hatch dates, which can have some issues with timing, especially if it's, say, during the rainy season and they're waiting for bugs and certain plants to emerge. It can really throw off some of that timing. It's called a phenological mismatch. So it really can reduce nestling survival. So we're predicting that a lot of songbirds will get a lot choosier about their nest sites, and we're going to see a lot more competition for the good, cool nest sites where they're not going to have to fight that constant influx of heat. So, however, birds might actually have some really cool ways to mitigate this. I've got a quick video here. This study was done by Mariette and Buchanan, I believe in 2017. I was in grad school when this came out, and we all had to stop our lab meeting to watch it because it was so mind-blowing. So I'm gonna, if this works, I'm gonna talk about the results of this at the end. Try something. I'm gonna try to get it full screen. Never mind. There's no sound of the video. That's a So to summarize that really quickly, this study basically found that during the last third of the incubation period, when temperatures were hotter, zebra finch parents made a very specific call that they've been now calling like a panting call. That's what they've discovered. It's like kind of a byproduct of panting after this paper came out. And that somehow, we have no idea how, but the eggs are able to hear it, and it's been repeated several times. So we know that there's actually something going on here, but somehow these nestlings are actually able to hear through the egg, and that impacts the growth of the nestling. So it slows down the growth, so maybe you're not seeing quite as much phenological mismatch, but they also have a smaller body size. And the advantage of having that smaller body size is that you're not producing as much heat because you're not having to burn as much energy, right? So you're better able to handle those hotter temperature conditions if you have a smaller body mass than, say, your sibling who might be several grams larger. So it's not all gloom and doom. I think there's some really unexpected ways that we'll see that birds can handle these high temperatures, and it'll be really interesting to keep tracking this as we learn more about it. So let's see if I can get this moved over to the next slide. So high temperatures not only affect nestlings, but they also affect reproduction, but kind of before the nestling even appears, right? So high temperatures, especially temperatures when you start getting in 95, 100, 105, which is not unheard of in parts of the United States, can have a real reduction in the number and quality of sperm in male songbirds. So numbers go down and their flagella, the little tails, don't quite form right. So they're not quite as able to swim and get to their goal as much. So we're likely going to see some drop-offs in reproductive success there. But aside from the physiological effects that we're seeing, well, actually, sorry, I mixed up my slides there. So we also see that impact on sperm, which can impact reproduction. But we also see something really cool going on. So we talked about thermal windows earlier, and a study came out in 2021 where these researchers did a huge meta-analysis looking at a bunch of studies that looked at tropical birds and bill size, tarsus length, and other metrics on birds where thermal windows could be. And they compared them over years. And what they found, one measurement they took was actually the cone of the bill. What they found was that actually these bird appendages are getting larger over the course of several generations, and their body size is getting smaller. So these thermal windows, these areas across which they can dissipate heat, are actually starting to get a lot larger, meaning it might be easier for them to thermoregulate as temperatures rise. So we are seeing some kind of positive responses in the ways that birds are handling heat. It's just kind of going to be a question of whether the Earth is warming up too fast for these changes to keep up with. So we can also see some pretty drastic impacts on bird behavior. So one study has found that songbirds can show decreased motor ability, so they're less coordinated, and decreased cognitive ability. So they're less able to think clearly. I mean, if you kind of think about this, think about like walking around again on a 95-degree day, kind of sluggish, it's hot, you're tired, you might not be thinking clearly. Birds kind of experience the same sort of thing. So I've got some cool videos here. I worked on this paper with a colleague named Ray Danner at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And what we did was we trained birds on what is called a detour reaching task. So we trained them with a solid black tube and a mealworm. Oh, we don't want that going just yet. Okay, so we trained them on the solid black tube with a mealworm in the middle, and the birds learned that there was a snack in the middle of the tube. I don't know why. Zebra finches are granivores, but for some reason, this particular group of zebra finches only wanted mealworms. We can't figure out why that was to this day, but why is this doing this? Okay. Okay. Stay. All right. So then we got to the part of the assay where we tested them at 2 different temperatures, but this time we gave them clear tubes. And if they pecked on the side of the tube, that was considered a fail because they had learned on the black tube that they had to reach around. So if the bird doesn't peck on the side of the tube at all and just grabs the food in the middle, that means they pass the test. So this is a bird under thermal neutral or comfortable temperature conditions. Let's see if this. And there's no sound to this one either. Reaches right in and grabs it. No problem at all. But we heated these birds up to about 43 Celsius. That's probably, like I said, I think about like 105, 110 Fahrenheit. I can't remember the exact conversions. So it's pretty toasty. We heated these birds up and we asked them to do the same thing. This is the same bird. 6, 7, 8, 9. So it took them a lot longer to solve that task. And we actually found that across our whole group of zebra finches. And the other thing that was interesting was we also timed how long it took them to process or actually consume those mealworms. And it slowed them down quite a bit. So we're seeing that kind of reduction in coordination and reduction in that cognitive ability that might cause them some issues when foraging out in the wild. So the other behavior that can be affected, and this is the behavior that I'm particularly interested in, is communication. So as I'm sure all of us know, birds communicate all the time. The males wake up and sing early in the morning. It's really, really important for their reproduction. But before we jump into how it impacts birds, I want to walk through a really basic model of communication. So in any system where two individuals are communicating, you have a signaler who produces a signal which contains information. That information is then transmitted to the environment through the environment, and that environment can sometimes have an effect on that signal. So say, if I were, say, shouting through a really loud room, for example, it might be really hard for somebody on the other side to hear what I'm saying. But right now, in a quiet room, it's pretty easy for people to hear what I'm saying. That's how the environment might impact the signal. But on the other side, we have another individual that's the receiver, which perceives the signal, processes the information in that signal, and then makes a decision about what to do with that information. So in birds, this plays out in a pretty straightforward way. In most songbirds, the male produces a song, the female listens to that song, decides, okay, I think he sounds pretty sexy, I want to mate with him. Then she makes a decision whether or not to mate with them, and then they go on to have offspring. But heat can affect this process at multiple stages. So I've predicted that heat could, 1, affect the signaler, 2, affect the receiver, and 3, it might even affect the signal itself. So we knew this we thought this was pretty likely for a couple of reasons. Because there was a study in 2016 that looked at 2 subspecies of song sparrow, Melospisa melodia and Melospisa melodia georgiana. One lived in the dunes, one lived out in flat open fields near the coast. And the birds that lived in the dunes had a much hotter environment, being right there on the beach, that sun bearing down. So what they did was they found that overall, both populations of these birds sang less when exposed to hot temperature. But the cool thing about this was that the birds with larger bills, which were the ones that lived in the dunes, were actually less impacted because they were exchanging so much more heat across their bills and able to dissipate that heat and didn't have to deal with the stress of that. So birds are finding ways to mitigate this, but we know that heat has an impact on songbird signalers in some way. So as part of my dissertation, I did a couple of studies. I tested male zebra finches singing at 2 temperatures, one at 35 degrees Celsius, which is like 85-ish. That's pretty comfortable for them, really. We actually house zebra finches much too cold than what they would like. So if you have a pet zebra finch, you might want to get it a heat lamp or something like that. Keep it nice and toasty. And we heated them up until we started to see those thermoregulatory behaviors. So we wanted to make sure that these birds were panting, that they had their wings spread out, that they were standing up really tall, to make sure that we knew these birds were heat stressed. And then we put a female in front of them and asked these birds to sing. And what we found, we can ignore the complicated stats. I stole this from a talk I gave for a conference, was that that males sang on average fewer song bouts when they were hotter than when they were at a comfortable temperature. And the other thing about this, which was pretty cool, was when we actually broke those songs down and looked at the individual notes that they sang, we found that those notes got faster. And that was consistent with some previous research where we did not do this. I want to make this clear before I say this, but there were some researchers that put some temperature probes into birds' brains and heated them up and recorded the songs they produced. And that was consistent with what the birds with the heated up brains did. So we know when they're getting hot, when they're getting heat stress, their brains are warming up and these songs are getting shorter, or these syllables are getting shorter. So they're singing less, they're producing shorter syllables, and at the end of the day, that just might not be as attractive to a female bird as a male who sings a more robust song and more songs. So I also wanted to ask whether receivers had the same impact. So I wanted to ask, are these females able to discriminate between these different male songs? Because if she's making a choice about who to mate with, and these guys do biparental care, so both parents take care of the nestlings, she wants to make sure that she's choosing a good partner to help her take care of her nestlings. So what I did was I gave these females a choice between two different kinds of songs. In this case, it was a zebra finch song, which was their own species, and a rufous collared sparrow song, which is a bird song that's very dissimilar to their own song, one that they've never heard before, just to make sure we didn't have any weird effects of familiarity. And then I asked them if they could discriminate between the two. So operant conditioning, you'll have probably heard of that in some aspect before. The most famous example is Skinner's box, but this is just a cognition trial where you ask an animal to do a behavior and you give it a reward for doing that behavior. So in Skinner's box, they ask a pigeon to peck a key, and if the pigeon pecked the key, the pigeon got food. Well, in this case, songbirds really like to hear song. So we asked these birds to hop on a perch, and if they hopped on that perch, we gave them a recording of a song. And this is how we gave them two choices. So we attached two perches to the front of each cage. Each one was hooked up to a different song. And we trained them that if they hopped on one of these perches, you'd hear a different song. And we were actually able to measure which song they preferred by the ratio of hops on one perch versus the other. And we were also able to tell how much effort they were putting in at different temperatures by just counting the number of perch hops. Because if they're just hopping a lot less, that would indicate that they care a lot less and are putting in a lot less effort. So it's kind of hard to explain in words. So I've got a quick video here. These are not my birds. These are swamp sparrows. This was an assay done on swamp sparrows out of the lab of Brindy Anderson at Florida Atlantic University. She was kind enough to share this video with me. But you can watch this bird hop from perch to perch and trigger the playback of songs. And I'll verbally say when the song plays for the people on Zoom. So she's hopped on the perch, that song plays. She's hopped on the other perch, a different song plays. And then the researchers at the end would calculate how many times she hopped on each perch to determine which song she liked more. Okay. I really want to show that again. Okay. So we tested these birds at 23 Celsius, so roughly 68 to 72 degrees Celsius for our control trial. And then I asked the females again to do this again at hot temperatures. I'm not entirely sure why, but the females got a lot more stressed out a lot earlier at hotter temperatures than the males did. So that's why we pulled those temperatures down a little bit. And what we found was actually pretty surprising. So I've got some spectrograms here of our two bird songs. So this image down here is a zebra finch song. I wish I had the audio file, but I don't. But it almost sounds like a dog with a squeaky toy, almost. That's the best way I can think to describe it. But this rufous collared sparrow song, as I'm sure many of you all are familiar here, is a very typical sparrow song. So you have the buzz, then you've got the trilling notes at the end. It's very very traditional bird song. So you can see just by visualizing them how different these songs must sound. Well, what we found, if you look at the x-axis here, you have our 23-degree control trial, our hot trial, and how much they preferred these songs. So if it's above this 50% line, that means that the bird preferred the conspecific song. But when we heated them up, so all our birds at our control temperature preferred our conspecific song. So they're the song of their own species. But when we heated them up, their preference for their own species song dropped off pretty significantly, which we were very, very surprised to see. Some of them, as you can see, if we drop below this 50% point, that means they would have preferred the song of the other birds. So some of them even actually preferred the rufous collared sparrow song under the hotter temperatures. So this shows that when females are heat stressed, there is some sort of cognitive breakdown happening, whether or not she's distracted by the heat or whether she's not processing signals as well in her ear and her brain. We don't know, but something is happening to where she is not discriminating between these two songs anymore. So the implications of both the effects of the signaler, the signal, and the receiver can have pretty wide sweeping effects for all individuals involved, because that is likely going to cause some losses of reproductive success. So if males don't sing as much, if they don't sing nearly as robust a song, they're going to be less able to attract a female and are going to be less likely to actually mate and produce offspring. And if females are confused about the songs they're hearing, she might mate with a lower quality male whose genetics will not be as beneficial for her offspring, or she might even accidentally try to mate with the wrong species, which would be a huge loss of energy for her. And over time, especially if we combine this with some of the other effects we see, such as the habitat loss and the reduction in sperm quality, we could start to see some pretty significant population declines and extinctions globally. But there's some room for future research. It's going to be really important in the next several years that we start to focus on studying survival and reproduction in North American songbirds. Most of the birds that I've talked about today are desert adapted species. So either South Africa or the Australian desert. I think the only North American songbird that I've specifically mentioned is the song sparrows earlier. So it's going to be really important, especially because we're already seeing population declines and extinctions in North America, that we understand how high temperatures are impacting reproductive success, from nesting to sperm quality to even their communication behaviors. And by doing this, we can start to understand more ways to maybe mitigate heat stress in wild songbird populations to help these populations survive as heat waves become more severe in the next several decades. So with that, if you wanted to do further reading on this, I wanted to leave you with some resources. So the Hot Birds Lab out of South Africa does a lot of really cool research. It is a combination of a lot of scientists like Dr. Andrew McKechnie, Dr. Susan Cunningham, and they spend a lot of time doing behavioral work out in the desert and watching how these birds are being affected by heat stress in real time. They do a lot of really cool work. They look at how they change their behavior, how are they able to acclimate to these temperatures. They also look at like trade-offs with other environmental factors like dehydration and water loss and evaporative cooling. The Griffiths Lab at Macquarie University, they also do a lot of really cool research as well. They mostly focus on zebra finches. Glenn Tattersall was the scientist who did the toucan study, where we were looking at thermal windows and how he was able to shut those how the bird was able to shut those blood vessels on and off. He does a lot of really interesting work, and his work is also filled with some really awesome photographs of different animals and birds thermoregulating. And then if you're interested in learning more about ongoing research into what's happening in North American songbirds, the Derryberry and Roswell labs out of Indiana University and the University of Tennessee Knoxville are also really great resources. There's a lot of work being published and worked on every day. A lot of that, I know for a fact, especially out of the Derryberry lab, that they've got a lot of cool stuff coming up that hasn't been published yet. So definitely a cool thing to keep an eye out for. And with that, I just wanted, since I talked about my research, I wanted to acknowledge all of the different resources that made this possible, from all of the undergraduate assistants who helped me do this research, my dissertation committee, and all of my different sources of funding. So thank you very much. And I think I can take questions.
I only got a question. So you showed that the birds, the females are less choosy when they're a little too hot, and that there's some cognitive decline.
Mm-hmm.
Does that also spill over into food choices or anti-predator behavior? Do they start making dumb mistakes in other parts of their life? Or could they?
I imagine they could. So there was one other study done that I did not talk about today, but we looked at a color association task with both male and female zebra finches. So we gave them a little plate that had little holes drilled into it. There was food in each of those little holes, and each of those wells was covered with a different colored disc. So we taught them to associate that food was associated with, say, yellow, right? And it was different for each individual. But when they were heated up, they spent a lot more time flipping the wrong colored disc. So I imagine it would probably carry over, especially into foraging and making for food decisions, which might be really important in a city where you're dealing with an urban heat island and you've got some things you definitely don't want to eat if you're a bird. So
I guess it's good news to know that birds are adapting somewhat.
They are.
To the heat.
Are the people online going to be able to catch Andy's?
Yeah, maybe you should repeat the question.
Or go up?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess I was asking, you know, do you have any idea how many generations it takes to make a significant change, like increasing those cooling windows?
Right. So Andy asked whether or how many generations it would take for birds to be able to change their cooling windows, for example. Honestly, the answer to that is we don't really know at this stage. Actually, studying thermoregulation in birds is a fairly new field because they can control their own body temperature. Scientists for a very long time kind of thought, well, that's not an interesting question. They can just control their own body temperature. So we're going to go look at like frogs and lizards that can't control their own body temperature. But then temperatures started getting so hot that it started having unexpected impacts. So yeah, we actually don't know. I think some follow-up studies are looking at whether there is a genetic link to see whether those changes even can be passed on generationally, or whether it's more of a like acclimation thing, kind of where the parent zebra finches were singing to the eggs. So trying to figure out what exactly the mechanism is behind that change.
There is a question.
Yeah.
You won't have to repeat this one. What was the projected timeline on the North American heat prediction map?
I think that was by 2050. I think that was by 2050. I'll need to double check that, but there was a 2050 projection and a 2100, and I think I pulled the 2050. Okay.
So at the other end of the, you know, the birds that are at the very northern end of bird territory, those birds presumably won't have anywhere to go. I mean, some of these birds can shift north, but those birds, they're already as far north as they can go.
Right.
So I think they are in for it the worst.
Yeah, so we really need to start kind of studying how to mitigate the effects for them, because like you said, they can't go any further. So yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Would there be any problem for these larger bills? I mean, it's a nice adaptation, but would it cause a problem eventually for them, their bills to be as bigger, or?
Yeah, so she was asking whether or not having a larger bill is going to cause any problems. It might be good for dissipating heat, but is that going to cause issues for any other function this bird may need its bill for? And actually, I'm putting in a grant proposal right now to study this, see if somebody will give me money to ask this question. But when birds sing, a lot of it can depend on how their song quality can depend on how quickly they can open and close their bill. So if you think about it like bouncing a basketball, you can bounce your basketball much faster from way down here, right? But if you're bouncing it from up here, you're gonna be able to bounce it much fewer times. So say in a trill, when a sparrow has to sing, it's really important how quickly it can open and close its beak. So if its beak gets too large, it might have a worse song, or it might not be able to sing as well. So quite possibly.
Quite possibly that slower song may become more attractive because it's a bird that is doing better.
It might. Yeah. So there are a lot of different research avenues and questions to ask going forward for sure.